Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on the 2020 census focused on the race question. This is the fourth installment of our monthly webinar series. Today, we are joined by our guest speaker, Dan Ichinose, who works with our affiliate, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles. This webinar will cover the history of the race question, what will be on the census form, and a deeper dive into the race question, and we'll also end with Q&A. At the end of this webinar, you can submit questions either through the chat box or the questions box in GoToWebinar. And as a reminder, this is the fourth installment in our monthly census webinar series. This webinar is recorded and we'll be posting the recording on YouTube afterwards. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Great, thanks so much. Can you folks hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Again, my name is Dan Ichinose. I direct the Demographic Research Project and Census Information Center at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles. We do research and analysis that supports community programs and advocacy. You see from the slide here, there are three main areas of work that we engage in. One is original research, and many of you may be familiar with the Community of a Contrast series that we've done in partnership with AAJC that attempts to consolidate, hopefully what is a lot of great data on Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that is useful in program planning, advocacy, fundraising, etc. We also do technical assistance, so working with community partners, policymakers, and others to respond to requests for data on our communities. And then finally, we do occasional trainings on how to use census data. Historically, that's really involved training folks on the Census Bureau's Great American Fact Finder tool. So given its importance in our upcoming work around the census, our goal for the webinar is to get folks more familiar with the race question. Not just to understand it ourselves, but to be able to answer questions from community members who may have them. So as Bessie mentioned, I'll cover a few topics. I'll start with a history of the race question, briefly flag some changes that were abandoned leading up to the 2020 census. But I'm going to spend most of my time digging into the race question that it'll appear on the 2020 census, looking at a few key parts of the question, including the categories that will appear, check boxes that capture race and race subgroups, write-in responses for smaller ethnic groups, examples used as part of the question, and the multiple race checkoff option that's been in place since the 2000 census. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to start with a history of the race question, and I want to preface that by saying what I think we all understand, right? Which is that historically the categories that the Census Bureau has used and the way they've asked the race question really reflects the social and historical context in which these categories were created, right? And as you can see from the categories that were included in 1790, that these categories and the way that the Bureau has historically asked the question reinforce a racial and gender hierarchy, and that's something we need to keep in mind as we think about the history of the race question, that it really can't be divorced from the context in which the census is being conducted. So the Census Bureau first included categories for Asian Americans starting in 1870 when they added a Chinese category to the decennial census. Japanese, as you can see, was added in 1890. And then some additional categories were added in 1920, Filipino, Korean, and interestingly, Hindu, right? And this is all obviously being added as populations in our various communities grew in size, particularly in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Next slide. Okay, we can see in 1950 that actually Korean and Hindu were removed. I did some digging as to why that was the case and couldn't find anything, but again, the categories have always been kind of in flux. In 1960, following the statehood in Hawaii in 1959, the Census Bureau added Hawaiian and part Hawaiian, right? And certainly this is following the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893 and subsequent colonization of Hawaii. In 1970, Korean was added back on, part Hawaiian was removed. And then in 1980, the categories began to look a little bit more like what we see today. And you can see that I've highlighted changes in orange. Asian Indian was added, Vietnamese was added, and for the first time, non-Hawaiian Pacific Islander ethnic groups were added. So Samoan was added, and Guamanian was added, and that will change as we'll see in a second. Next slide. So in 1990, other Asian or Pacific Islander was added, right, and that helps capture greater diversity in our communities, and I'll talk a little bit about how that happens when we dig into the 2020 question. But in 2000, some significant changes occurred. As you can see in orange, other Asian was added. Guamanian, Chamorro was added to Guamanian, so the term was Guamanian and Chamorro in 2000 and 2010. Other Pacific Islander were added. And as you note that there are separate catch-all categories for Asian and Pacific Islanders, and that was primarily because Pacific Islanders were separated from Asian Americans in response to a lot of great advocacy from the Pacific Islander community, recognizing the unique needs of Pacific Islander communities and the fact that PI communities historically have been lost under the broader Asian American and Pacific Islander umbrella. So that was a really critical change that occurred in 2000. Another major change was that multiracial folks were allowed for the first time the opportunity to check multiple race categories, right? That reflected the identity that folks, multiple identities that folks have. And I was talking with Terry Owl from AAJC a little bit the other day about this presentation, and she thought it was important to kind of mention some of the civil rights context here, right? That there was an interest in allowing for multiple race checkoff as opposed to a single multiracial category as a way of recognizing multiracial people as included in the various communities of color that they identify with, right? And that's really important for civil rights enforcement purposes, so that the true size of any given community of color can be accurately gauged, relative to a specific civil rights issue. Next slide, please. Okay, so as the 2020 census approached, the Census Bureau was considering some additional changes. It conducted what it called the alternative questionnaire experiments and some additional testing that explored maybe three core changes. One of the major changes that they were exploring was the merging of the race and Hispanic origin questions. And again, we'll get into the detail of how those questions are asked. But historically, the Census Bureau has asked race and Hispanic origin questions separately, right? Recognizing Latinos or the Hispanic origin category as an ethnic category rather than a racial category. And as a result, there were many in the Latino community who didn't see themselves represented in the race question at all. And so given quite a bit of testing that the Census Bureau had done, it made sense to merge those two questions. A second change that was being explored was the creation of a Middle Eastern North African or MENA race category. Certainly, historically, folks from MENA communities also did not see themselves represented in the race question, many responding that they were white or some other race in the race question historically. And then finally, an additional change that was being explored was the inclusion of checkboxes for all communities. And we'll kind of take a look at the checkboxes that exist in the 2020 census form. But the checkboxes historically had been a really critical tool for increasing subgroup or ethnic group identification, particularly for Asian American and Pacific Islander groups. And so a final change that was being explored was to utilize checkboxes to promote subgroup or ethnic group identification across racial groups, not just for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Unfortunately, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, declined to revise standards that would allow these changes to be adopted. So in order for decennial census to move forward with a set of categories, the Office of Management and Budget needs to align its standards with those changes, and it declined to do so. Some people saw that as a political move, but it resulted in relatively little changes moving into the 2020 census. So why don't we take a look at what will be on the form? So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so what we see here are what will be on the form with respect to Hispanic origin and race. So we see question 6 as the Hispanic origin question, question 7 being the race question. And Terry also pointed out that there's one minor change here in terms of what will be on the 2020, and that is that folks answering the Hispanic origin question won't have the option of checking more than one box as indicated here. The order of these questions has changed over time. Previously, I think this was maybe 2 or 3 censuses ago, the Hispanic origin question actually followed the race question. But that really resulted in increased confusion among Latino communities as to how they would respond to the race question. So the order was changed to allow the Hispanic origin question to be asked first, and that was done in an attempt to facilitate a better response to the race question among Latino communities. Unfortunately, it hasn't really resolved the question fully. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's, again, our focus will be on the race question itself. So we've kind of zoomed in to the race question, and you can see the categories that will be included and the approach that the Census Bureau is taking in terms of how it's asking these questions. So we can see the first category is white, with a number of examples are provided, and I'll dig into those examples, particularly for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in a second. But let's just take a look at the form. Followed by a write-in response option below it. And that's also, I should mention that that's also a change that the Bureau has instituted, providing those who are white or Black or African American the option to write in an ethnic group identification. So Black or African Americans is the second category. American Indian or Alaskan Native is the third category. Right in here, folks are mostly writing in their tribal affiliation. And then we can see the checkboxes here. In terms of the categories, we can see one major change relative to the 2010 census is the transition from a Guamanian or Chamorro category to Chamorro category alone, right? And we know that Guamanian is more of a national identity rather than an ethnic group identity. And there was a lot of advocacy from the Pacific Islander community that resulted in this change. So in 2020, the category will be Chamorro. One minor change too, relative to 2010, was the order of the checkboxes. So previously the checkboxes were ordered based on populations, based on alphabetical order. Now they're organized based on population size, but I'll get into this in a little bit. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's look at the checkboxes specifically. Okay, and I've circled in orange the checkbox area, right? And so we can see the groups that are included for Asian Americans, Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, and other Asian category, and then Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, and an other Pacific Islander category. And you know, one clear difference that certainly is easily apparent is that these checkboxes are available only to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Again, in recognition of the tremendous ethnic diversity that exists in our communities, and what is a very significant need for disaggregated data on our diverse communities. I should mention that the groups that are listed here, right, are the largest groups. Chinese Americans being the largest Asian American ethnic group nationally. Obviously, that varies depending on the state that you live in. Followed by Filipinos, Asian Indians, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese. And then similarly for the Pacific Islander community, the largest communities are Native Hawaiian, Samoan, and Chamorro. Okay, so that's the rationale for which checkboxes. Next slide, please. Okay, so for example, a respondent who is Indian would obviously check the checkbox for Asian Indian, and the terminology, I should mention maybe the terminology for Asian Indian is adopted to distinguish it from Native Americans, right, or American Indians. So just to kind of, next slide, please. So to illustrate some of the resulting data, right, I thought we would, I'm a researcher, so I can't do a presentation without including some data. So I wanted to illustrate the kinds of resulting data that are produced from the response to the race question. So I'm using some tables from our Communities of Contrast series. This one is from our national report, which we released quite a while ago in 2011. But it shows that the Asian Indian population numbers about 3.2 million nationally. We see that Indian Americans are the third largest ethnic group, Asian American ethnic group nationwide. And I didn't mention it here, but the data also allow us to gauge the growth of communities, and these data, again, comparing 2000 to 2010, the last two decennial censuses, showed that the Indian population grew an astonishing 68% nationally over that decade. So a lot of great data that result from this particular question. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know that given the tremendous ethnic diversity in our communities, it would be very difficult to include checkboxes for all groups. So that's where these write-in responses that are included in the question are really critical to capturing the diversity that exists in our communities. So for those groups, and you can see highlighted here are the checkboxes that are available for every racial group. But we recognize that given the diverse groups that we want to capture, that something like this, like a write-in response, is really critical to allowing smaller subgroups to indicate their ethnic identity in the form. Moving forward, there's a couple things to note, particularly relative to advocacy and outreach efforts around the 2020 census. One thing to note is that as smaller Asian American and Pacific Islander ethnic groups move to indicate their ethnic identity using the write-in responses, that a lot of groups representing those targeted ethnic groups often attempt to standardize the way that communities are instructed to respond. So for example, in say Taiwanese or Cambodian communities, there would be specific instructions that are provided to community members as to how to respond, right? So to literally say Taiwanese or to literally say Cambodian, right? And this helps ensure that data that's captured in the write-in is allocated to that particular ethnic group, right? Or is captured accurately for those smaller race subgroups in the census. It's not always possible to get everyone to respond consistently, right? I mean, ethnic identities vary. Folks may identify slightly differently, right? Folks who are Cambodian may not strictly identify as Cambodian. An example oftentimes that I will use is with respect to the Native Hawaiian community. Folks may not identify as Native Hawaiian. They may identify as Kanaka or Kanaka Maoli, right? And check the other Pacific Islander box and write that in. So what the Census Bureau has done is develop glossaries of possible responses, right, that may be associated with that particular ethnic group. So for example, for Native Hawaiians, in its glossary, it would include Native Hawaiian, Hawaiian, Kanaka, Kanaka Maoli, as possible ways that a respondent could identify as Native Hawaiian. And then those write-in responses would be reallocated to the larger category. So that's also something that advocates have worked with the Bureau to make sure is accurate, ensuring that the Bureau has as full a list of possible responses associated with a particular ethnic group as possible. Okay, next slide, please. So someone who is Marshallese would check other Pacific Islander and simply write in Marshallese in the box below. And you can see that there's a single box for both other Asian and other Pacific Islander categories. And then that person would be recorded by the Bureau as being Marshallese. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, to illustrate the great data that result from the race question, in 2010, the Census Bureau noted over 22,000 Marshallese living in the United States. The data allow us to see the growth of that community. Between 2000 and 2010, the community grew an astonishing 237%, right? So amazing growth that we're seeing in Marshallese communities that would not otherwise be visible were it not for the race question. It also allows us to look at the geographic distribution of ethnic groups. So we see that the largest Marshallese communities are in the states of Hawaii, Arkansas, and Washington state. And it's certainly, one dynamic here is that, folks who are writing in their ethnic identity using the write-in responses tend to be missed at a higher level. Again, this is based on largely anecdotal information, but when you look at community reports as to the size of populations, they tend to be much larger than is captured in some other the write-in responses. So it really goes to underscore the importance of getting folks to understand the write-in option and doing things like standardizing response. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so folks will note that there are examples that are listed for particular both race groups and race subgroups. And certainly these are used to allow folks a better understanding of the concrete race categories that are used and the what groups might be included under an other Asian or other Pacific Islander subgroup categories. You know, a common question that folks will get, right, will be, why isn't my group listed here? You know, the Bureau has adopted a population size approach to not only, as I mentioned earlier, the creation of the checkboxes, but also the examples that are used. So as you can see here, that I've highlighted in orange, the examples that are used for other Asian are Pakistani, Cambodian, and Hmong, and these are the three next largest groups after Japanese Americans. Similarly, for Pacific Islanders, the next largest groups after Chamorro are those listed here: Tongan, Fijian, and Marshallese. Again, so important to note that the examples that are listed are chosen based on population size. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that a major change that occurred in the 2000 census was providing multiracial folks the opportunity to check any race or race subgroup category that was consistent with their multiple identities, right? And this was an important step towards allowing multiracial people to identify the way they truly identify, but also to create more inclusive measurement of both race groups and race subgroups. An important thing to note here, right, is that multiple subgroup write-in responses can be accommodated. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of illustrating a couple of ways that multiracial folks might identify. So, for example, someone who is Haitian and Japanese would check Black or African American, write in their Haitian American identity in the write-in response box provided, and then check Japanese as is indicated here. Next slide, please. Again, I mentioned that multiple subgroup write-in responses can be accommodated. Here, you know, for someone who is both Hmong and Laotian ancestry, they would check other Asian and then literally write Hmong and Laotian in the write-in response box provided. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is these options for multiple race checkoff is important because Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are disproportionately multiracial. About 15% of Asian Americans nationwide as of the 2010 census were multiracial. You know, certainly those rates are higher among particular ethnic groups. You could see from this particular chart, 35% of Japanese Americans are multiracial. Again, these are data taken from our national report on Asian Americans. Next slide, please. And again, I mentioned the disproportionate rates among both Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The issue is even more critical for Pacific Islander communities. As of the 2010 census, about 56% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders as a broader racial group were multiracial. an astonishing 69% of Native Hawaiians who responded to 2010 census indicated multiple race ancestry. So this option of allowing multiracial folks to indicate more than one identity or to check more than one category is particularly critical for Pacific Islanders. And so, educating folks about the opportunity to check more than one box is particularly critical to ensuring an accurate count of Pacific Islander communities. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, hopefully it gives folks a better sense as to how the race question has been asked over time, and some of the dynamics that exist with respect to the question as it'll be asked in 2020. Hopefully folks are more familiar with the categories as they will appear, the presence of checkboxes that promote ethnic group identity and are really critical to allowing us to provide great disaggregated data. The existence of these write-in response boxes, right, for smaller ethnic groups. And again, I really can't underscore enough the importance of educating folks in those communities that will be reliant on the write-in response boxes about the fact that they exist and do as many across various Asian American and Pacific Islander ethnic groups have done in the past, which is to create a campaign to standardize response that would be included in the write-in response boxes. Hopefully folks have a better sense as to why those particular examples are used or will be used in the 2020 census, other Asian and other Pacific Islander categories, and then again have a better understanding of the multiple race checkoff option, and really the importance of educating folks about that option, particularly in communities such as Japanese American communities, but particularly for Pacific Islander communities, to ensure an accurate response of what oftentimes are very small communities, right? So being able to secure an inclusive count of those communities is particularly critical. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and hopefully this has been helpful.
Thank you, Dan. So now we're going to open it to questions. So if you're on the GoToWebinar platform, you can either go into the chat box and type in your question, or if you raise your hand, we can unmute your line and you can ask a question. Great, and our first question is from Jonathan. Jonathan said this was very helpful. And how do we find out the glossary to see what ethnic groups are listed under Laotian?
Right, so the Census Bureau has staff who are responsible for kind of creating and maintaining these glossaries. So I think it would be a matter of identifying the staff person responsible for particular communities. For example, we work closely with someone in the Bureau several years ago who was in charge of a Pacific Islander and specifically Native Hawaiian, creating the Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian glossaries, and received those directly from that particular staff person. So if you're interested, please reach out to one of us, and we would be happy to kind of dig in a little bit and identify the staff person who would be responsible for maintaining the glossaries for your particular community. But again, as I mentioned, that advocacy is particularly important given the diverse ways that folks may identify ethnically.
Thanks, Dan. And also our contact information will be on the last slide. So if there are any questions after the webinar, you can email us and we'll send you the information via email. And our second question is from Lynn Crowley. What is the update with the citizenship question?
Well, perhaps other folks can answer that question better than I. But the work around the citizenship question is proceeding kind of on two fronts, right? I mean, one is certainly in the courts, right? So there were a number of challenges, legal challenges to the race question, to the citizenship question that were filed. Some of them were consolidated. The consolidated court cases in New York moved forward and are being heard as we speak. Maryland and California litigation will be heard starting in January. So certainly we're hoping that these legal challenges will be successful, but we also need to be prepared for the possibility that the citizenship question will be on the form. And we're kind of running through different scenarios as to how to encourage folks to respond. But that's an update on the citizenship question.
And for those of you who are working with communities that have a lot of questions around the citizenship question, we do have two resources about the citizenship question and debunking the myths, and it's also available in Chinese and Vietnamese, so we can send that out following this webinar as well.
That's great.
And we have another question. This is from Marianne. Will we be coming up with an education strategy to help folks know their write in or type in their ethnicity and to be specific, or will there be drop-down menus?
I don't believe there will be drop-down menus that capture the range of responses, right? Historically, the Bureau has had folks write in and then uses these glossaries to categorize the responses they receive, right? So yes, there'll certainly be educational campaigns, as there have been in past censuses, to get folks, as I was mentioning, to better understand how the question will be asked, but perhaps just as importantly, to develop some standardized way for communities to respond, to simplify the data processing on the back end. So yes, that will certainly be part of campaigns moving forward, and those discussions will likely happen next year.
Thank you. And it looks like we have no further questions at this time. We do have a number of webinars coming up in 2019, so please stay tuned and we'll be sharing more information about those webinars and registration details. And again, if you have any additional questions following this webinar, please don't hesitate to email Dan or our census team. And we will be sharing the recording and slides with you following today's webinar. So thank you, Dan, for your presentation, and thank you for everyone who's on the webinar for joining us today.
Thanks so much.